Okay, so we're going to look at Genesis chapter 5 and recognize that God gives genealogical information in that chapter and real history about the human race. And one of the things that we see is that that is confirmed in the New Testament. In the book of Jude, the 14th verse, he refers to Enoch as being the seventh from Adam. And that's inclusive numbering, by the way. So he doesn't mean the seventh after Adam. He means the seventh person when you start with Adam. So Adam is the first, and then you have Seth and Enos and Canaan and Mahalalel, and then Jared. Jared is older than I thought. Wow. Yeah. And then of course that's assuming we go with the Masoretic text. If we go with the Septuagint, then we run into something silly, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But so Enoch, the fact that he is the seventh generation is confirmed in the Epistle of Jude, and so that gives us one more reason to trust Genesis. Of course, we already should have been trusting Genesis anyway. In fact, John chapter 5, verses 44 through 47 it gives us that very same directive that we need to take the books of Moses seriously, that we don't sit in judgment on the books of Moses. It's the other way around. We will be judged one day by what we did with the books of Moses. And the Lord Jesus basically endorsed the books of Moses in that passage. And interestingly said that the way that people treat the books of Moses are going to indicate whether they want the applause of man or they want the applause of God. And that's John 5:44. Okay, now we get to Methuselah. And this is a dangerous area for me to talk about. And I'm looking at my wife, and Sherry has told me many times, don't do math in public. But what can I say? This is part of this lesson, so I'm just going to go into it very slowly. We're going to look at some math here. The Masoretic text, which is the preserved Hebrew text, gives us information with numbers about the ages and some of the events that happened in the lives of the patriarchs. And so we're told that so-and-so was born when such and such was so many years old. So we're dealing with numbers. And that means that we need, the math has to work out. I mean, God doesn't make mistakes, so the math's going to work out. And in the Masoretic text, it does. But we're told in, I think it's Romans 3:2, that God gave the oracles of God. He entrusted the keeping, the preservation, the transmission of the scriptures to the Jewish people. Not to the Greek people, but to the Jewish people. So we should look to the Jewish people for the actual preserved text of Scripture. However, there is a document called the Septuagint, which that's a whole can of worms that we won't get into other than to do one math problem. Because if we follow the information in the Hebrew text, the math works out. And what we will find is that based on the Hebrew text, Methuselah died the same year that the flood hit the earth. Okay, we'll go through the math in a minute to show that that's the case. It's interesting, S. Maxwell Coder of Moody Bible Institute, in his book, Jude, the Acts of the Apostates, he points out that the name Methuselah may actually contain a prophecy, that it may have the idea in that name Methuselah that when he dies, it is sent. And if that is referring to the man Methuselah, in the year that he dies, the flood is sent. So that was just something that Maxwell Coder of Moody Bible Institute suggested, that the name Methuselah may have actually been a prophecy that the flood was coming. And if that was the case, that would explain two things. It would explain why his father, Enoch, suddenly got spiritual in a way that was unprecedented, to where he didn't even die. God translated him. So something happened very unusual in the life of Enoch. Maybe it had something to do with, he was told that this baby was going to live until the flood came. If that was the case, that also indicates that God is very merciful, because Methuselah lived longer on earth than any other human. So if so, that would be an illustration of God's very patient mercy to have Methuselah live 969 years and then have him die, and then fulfill the promise that the flood would come and destroy the world. Okay, well, whether that is correct or not, Methuselah is certainly noteworthy because of living 969 years, and based on the Hebrew text, if you do the math, he does die in the same year that the flood hits the planet. So how do we get that? Okay, we are told that Methuselah became the father of Lamech when Methuselah was 187. And then we're told that after Lamech was fathered by Methuselah, that Methuselah lived another 782 years. So far, so good. So that means 187 before his son is born or begotten, and 782 after Lamech comes along. So when you add those two, you get 969. Okay, so far so good. In fact, Genesis 5:27 indicates that Methuselah's total lifespan was 969. So that works, because 187 and 782 do equal 969. And even I can handle that arithmetic-wise. Now, we also learned that Lamech was 182 when he begat Moses. And we see that in Genesis 5:28 through 29. And since Methuselah lived 782 years after Lamech was born, that would mean that Methuselah lived 600 years after Noah was born. Now, how do we get that? Okay, Methuselah lived 782 years after Lamech was born. We saw that in Genesis 5:25 through 26. And if we subtract from that the 182 years, because Lamech was 182 when Noah was begotten, then that means subtracting the 182 from the 782, you get 600. So that means of Methuselah's years after Lamech was born, 600 of those years were after Noah was born, and 182 of those years were before Noah was born. Y'all with me so far? That means that Noah was 600 years old when Methuselah died. Okay, so Methuselah he lives 182 years after Lamech is born, and then Lamech fathers Noah, and Methuselah continues to live another 600 years, and then he dies. Well, Genesis 7:11 tells us that the flood hit when Noah was in his 600th year. So that means Noah was 600 when Methuselah died, and it also means Noah was 600 when the flood hit. Put those two together, that means Methuselah died the same year that the flood hit. Okay? All that math works out. We expect that from the Bible. But if we look at the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation, which I won't get into why, because that would be too much of a rabbit trail for this particular presentation, but the oldest copies that we have of what's called the Septuagint are church age documents. They are centuries after the apostolic age. Those are the oldest copies that we have of the Septuagint. And the three oldest copies are contained within documents called Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. And of course, we know that those documents themselves can't be earlier than the first century, because those documents themselves, as part of those documents, have the New Testament with them. Okay, so the Greek Septuagint tells us that Methuselah fathered Lamech when he was 167, and you got the Greek there in red, and that he lived 802 years after. All right, so that's different from 187 and 782. This is 167 and 802. And then the Septuagint version of Genesis 5:27 says that Methuselah had a total lifespan of 969. We're used to that. That's what the Masoretic text has. So that number doesn't surprise us. But it's the fact that that number is composed of 167 and 802. That's the difference. How does that make a difference? Well, the Septuagint says Lamech was 188 when Noah is fathered. Since the Septuagint says Methuselah lived 802 years after Lamech was born, then Methuselah would have to have lived 614 years after Noah was born. Not 600, but 614. Why is that a problem? Well, the Septuagint says Noah was in his 600th year when the flood hit. No surprise there. That's what the Masoretic text says. But the problem is, if Noah was 600 when the flood hit, but Methuselah lived 614 years after Noah was born, that means Methuselah died, according to Septuagint, 14 years after the flood hit, which means he had really good upper body strength. He was hanging on to the outside of the ark. He weathered the storm. He came out the other side of the flood and continued to live for another 13 years. Now, I'm not great at math, but I can do better than that. That's a real problem. And that's not just a problem for one of the copies of the Septuagint. That same problem, that math error, is in the three oldest copies of what we today call the Septuagint. Well, anyway, just an example of how you can use detailed studies in the original text to deal with controversies. Now we'll go on to another flood controversy, a very different one, but it goes back to the same basic thing, and that is there were only 8 people who survived the flood. 8 humans survived the flood. That's it. All right. Methuselah was not one of them. In the late 1980s, Sherry and I became friends with a Chinese couple. They were here in America as graduate students attending universities, and they were from mainland China, which means they were raised in communism. They were raised in atheism. They were not raised in Christianity. And in the process of us getting to know them, we would do things with them. We would go to an art museum. We would go to, picnic. I mean, we did different things. And we got to know them, and they got to know us. And they learned about our Christian faith. And we encouraged them to take the Bible seriously and learn about God who is presented in the Bible. And of those two, the wife became a Christian. And the husband had difficulties believing that the Bible was completely trustworthy. And his main concern was, why did Christianity grow in the West and not in the Orient? Or the way he said it was, why would God, the God of the Bible, reveal himself to people in the West, but not to people in China? Does it mean that he loves the people of the West more than he loves the people of China? Why didn't he reveal himself to the people in China? How would you answer that question? Well, they moved to Austin, and I had a lawyer exam that I had to attend in Austin in 1990, and I had some time, so I went to visit them, and we visited for a while, and then the wife decided it was time to go to sleep, and so she left the living room, and my Chinese friend and I continued to talk in the living room about Christ and the Bible and different things. And we talked to the wee hours of the night. But that was his problem, was, does God really care about the Chinese? And so I said, I don't know the Chinese language, but obviously you do. But I've been told that your language is not an alphabet-based language. So you don't have words composed of letters, but rather it's a pictograph-based language. So you have little symbols that have word meanings, and some word symbols are combinations of other symbols. And my friend said, yep, that's the way it is. I said, well, I've been told that the word for flood in Chinese includes the symbol for 8, as in the number 8. Is that the case? And so he got out something to write on, and he showed me the word for flood. And I said, well, what is the word flood based on? And he said, well, it's the word for water and the word for total. And I went, well, there you go. I said, so there isn't any 8 in there? He said, well, come to think of it, the word for total is formed by combining the word for together and earth and 8. So there is an 8. This 8 becomes part of the word total. And then the word total is added to the word for water, and the total water is the flood. I said, so in other words, you got an 8 in there. What's that doing? I mean, it makes sense that you have the symbol for earth, because the flood happens on the earth, and together, you got everything all together. But why is 8 part of that? And he said, well, it doesn't have to make sense. I said, well, it does. The book of Genesis says there were 8 people who survived the flood of all humanity. And so when the Chinese people were inventing their language from the start, after the Tower of Babel, when all the languages are changed and people are speaking different languages and migrating different parts of the world, the people who would become the Chinese are taking their new language and going eastward, and they decide, we're going to have a written language. And so when they make up a word for flood, they're reminded of the 8 people who survived the flood. So the word 8, the symbol for 8 becomes part of the symbol, the composite symbol for flood. At that, my friend got to think. And then he said, the word for boat has an 8 in it. It's got 8 mouths, meaning like 8 mouths to feed, 8 people in a container, in a vessel. 8 people container, that's a boat. So when they were inventing their written language, they decided that the word for boat should have as one of its ingredients the number 8. So we talked about 1 Peter 3:20 and how it says 8 souls were saved by water. And then my friend said, that means that the Chinese had the same information that is in your Bible. At one time, they had that same information. In fact, it was at the time when they were making up their language. God did reveal himself to them. He did care enough to give them that information. And they didn't protect it. And they wasted it. But that's not God's fault. So he decided God could be trusted. And he became a Christian that night. Soon after that, they got ready to leave the country, and they told Sherry and me, don't contact us. Because if you were to try to contact us in China, it would just get us in trouble. It might even get us imprisoned or even killed. Christianity is forbidden there. So, if there's ever a time when it's safe for us to talk to you, to contact you, we'll find you, we'll contact you, but don't you try to contact us. Okay, that was 1990. Well, about 28 years later, I've got a very common name, Jim Johnson. I mean, think of all the Jim Johnsons are out there. Some of them are defaulting on student loans. Some of them are not paying their mortgages. Some are in jail for felonies. I mean, there's all kinds of Jim Johnsons. And there's even a Jim Johnson. There's a lot of Jim Johnsons who are lawyers, even in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And one of them apparently does a lot of work defending defendants who are accused of controlled substance violations. And so there was a time when I would get phone calls at night from somebody saying, I'm here at Lou Sterrett Jail. You need to come down and help me out. They got me on controlled substance again. I want you to get me off again. And I say, I'm not the one who got you off. Well, you're Jim Johnson. You're a lawyer, right? Yeah, but not the one you're thinking of. Anyway, so I've got a common name. And we moved. So we had a different street address. And our phone numbers changed. And our email changed multiple times after that. So how in the world are they ever going to find us? Well, anyway, 28 years later, I get an email. And it says, are you the Jim Johnson from the Dallas area who gave us this Bible? See attached photograph. And of course it had an entry in there from 1990. So they had made it back to America. They were Christians, active in a Chinese Christian church, had kids who they'd raised as Christians. And they were living in California, and I said, I'm going to be in California in a couple months. Let's meet together. So we met not just in any place. We met in the original A&W, the original, in Lodi, California. And that's what you see up there is 28 years later. But anyway, all of which is to say, 8 souls. That one detail is important, and that really helped my friend. Okay, move on to another Genesis word study. Genesis 8:3 talks about the flood waters when they were draining. So we're still talking about the flood. And the King James translates it as, the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. The verbs there that talk about the waters and how they were draining, it is not describing a situation where here is a solid earth, and then water all around it, encompassing it, and then the water is gently draining down. That's not what this verse is talking about. This verse is talking about how it was a very turbulent situation when the waters were draining, and the waters were going to and fro and back and forth, and they're jerking in these huge tidal waves across the land continents as the water is going down. And as a result, when you see rock layers that look like the water and the mud and the grit and the fossil, the critters that turn into fossil, whatever it was, when you can tell that the flow of the water was going this way, and then it got squashed and hardened. And then the next one above it, the flow of that water, that muddy, gritty water, was flowing that way. When you see this back and forth pattern in the rock layers, that's what Genesis 8:3 is talking about. It's saying that the waters were, they were halok vashuv. They were haloking and shuving. They were walking or going in one direction, and then they were returning. And this is these are infinitives that function like participles, basically showing that this is a continuing action. But anyway, the idea is the water is going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in a continual way, and that matches what we see in the rock layers. So that's Genesis 8:3 that talks about the waters returning from the earth in a way that halok vashuv, going back and forth. And I think we mentioned this before. Genesis 8:22 tells us that the earth will be predictable after the flood. So we have the seasons, we have temperature changes up and down, and we have day and night cycle all the time. And that's very much depended upon by creatures all over the world. The birds that migrate, I see some turnstones and other birds here on Delaware Beach. They're coming from South America. They're headed to Canada, and they're using up a lot of energy while they're flying. And so what they need is some fast food. They need, instead of In-N-Out Burger, they need a place where they can land real quick, get a whole bunch of energy, and then take off and keep flying back toward Canada. And they've already been flying a lot, so they burn up a lot of energy. They need a lot of energy fast. And they show up every year on the Delaware Beach at the time of year when the horseshoe crabs are coming in to land to lay their eggs by the gazillions. And so if for every horseshoe crab mother who lays a multitude of eggs, if just 3 or 4 of those survive to adulthood, that will be adequate to maintain the population of the horseshoe crabs. So that means the other millions of eggs can be eaten by these migratory birds and power their flight northward till they get to Canada, where their breeding grounds are going to be. And when they sometimes open up these migratory birds to see what's inside them, they find that more than 90% of what's inside them are these horseshoe crab eggs when they leave from there. So they really depend on that for a pit stop to get refueled and then take off again. But that wouldn't work unless the birds know when to land there, because the horseshoe crabs are just coming to shore that same day or that same week. And of course, that's based on the lunar cycle. And so the regularity that God has given to the sun and the moon and their relationship to the earth makes all the difference in these birds having the food there when they need it, where they need it. Another example of that would be the migratory behavior of the monarch butterfly. And God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, be fruitful, multiply the earth. He also told the critters that they're to fill different parts of the earth. And in the case of the monarch butterfly, they have a very interesting life cycle, and it's something that, of course, could never happen by evolutionary chance, because one generation may start in Saskatchewan, Canada, and in the fall, that one generation will fly all the way to Mexico for their wintering grounds. But then when it's beginning of spring, winter is almost over, the next generation of monarchs, they won't fly all the way to Canada. Rather, they will fly part of the way, maybe a third of the way, and then they will settle there, reproduce there, and then their children will be the ones who go maybe the next third of the way to Canada, and then they will reproduce, and then their children will be the ones that actually go to Canada. So you have 3 generations, in some cases they've measured 4, going north, and then 1 generation going south. So you can't say that one generation is teaching the next generation, now you need to go south. Well, because the ones that are actually going to go south, their great-great-grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the ones who did that. So God has designed a whole lot of very tricky programs inside these creatures so that they do what they do. And you have this very small little creature, and it's going thousands of miles and not even going in a straight line. You see how butterflies fly? I mean, that doesn't look like that's very efficient, but they live, they're able to do it. And how big is their brain? I mean, their heads are teeny enough as it is, and somewhere within that head is a little teeny brain, and that brain knows how to follow the sun so that it doesn't get lost or get off track. And yet that brain is calculating how the sun moves during the day so that it adjusts for where the sun is in the day to where it's always going north instead of as the sun moves it gets lost. And it's just totally amazing. Well, they tend to migrate through the prairies, and as a result they pretty much follow Interstate 35. And so the monarchs, I mean, there's other pathways, migratory pathways of the monarchs. There's one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and there's actually one that goes through Grand Canyon. But probably the most famous one is the one that pretty much tracks Interstate 35 and goes, actually this map shows it stopping in Minnesota, but actually goes farther into Canada. But they illustrate Genesis 9:1. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in part 2 on Saturday. But God said that he was making a covenant regarding how the earth will be operated after the flood. And then he made that covenant not just with humans, but God said that he was making that covenant with every living creature, every nephesh chaya, every breathing thing of life for perpetual generations. And then he instituted the rainbow as the signatory, as the physical sign of that covenant. All right, we're almost out of the book of Genesis illustrations, and we come to Genesis 25:34, and this is the case of the farmer and the hunter, Jacob and Esau. And interesting verb shows up in Genesis 25:34. Do not think of the birthright for soup deal as one in which Jacob took advantage of his twin brother who is about to starve to death, crawling across the sand 2 inches away from dying, and hated to give up his birthright, but was willing to live another 5 minutes with life-saving soup. Makes for a dramatic story. It's probably been taught in more pulpits than one, but it's just doesn't fit Scripture. The truth is, Esau was very carnal. He did not care about the birthright. This was not any old birthright. Whoever had this birthright would be in the Messianic line. That meant nothing to him. Frankly, he'd rather have a $5 bowl of soup, or I guess in today's prices, a $15 bowl of soup. But the way that we know that he really did not value his birthright is because of this verb that is used in Genesis 25:34, which is translated despised. And Esau despised his birthright. I'd rather have a bowl of soup. Well, how about that? The book of Obadiah, the smallest book in the Old Testament, is about how God is judging the nation Edom for all of the wickedness that nation is guilty of. And that nation is descended from Esau. And the book of Obadiah talks about their pride, compares their pride to the high, the eagle who has a nest way up on high on top of a cliff or something like that. And God is saying, the nation Edom is filled with pride and lifted up and think you're bulletproof, that kind of a thing. And God is not impressed. God is not impressed with their violence. God is not impressed with their deception. God is not impressed with their idolatry. In fact, God despises their sin. And it's the same word that was used in Genesis 25:34, that Esau despised the spiritual value of the messianic birthright. And centuries later, God deemed Edom despised, specifically the civilization, if you could call it that, the ungodly nation that descended from Esau, and who embodied a lot of the same character faults. Okay, that reminds me of how one man's trash is another man's treasure. When you think about what is valuable, our entire economy is based on people disagreeing about what is valuable. Because when you think about a buyer and a seller, if you have a buyer who has money, and you have a seller who has a good or a service, and the seller says, I will give you this good, or I will give you this service if you'll give me this much money. For this deal to happen, the buyer has to value the good or the service more than the money. And so the buyer lets go of the money and takes the good or the service. The seller has to value the money more than retaining the good or the service. So unless they both disagree about which is worth more, you don't have a deal. So our entire economy is based on people having different opinions about what is more valuable than something else. If you know, that's what drives the deal. So anyway, this slide here just basically says the same thing. So when you think about the deal between Esau and Jacob, they disagreed about the value of the birthright. Esau despised the birthright. It was worth less to him than a bowl of soup. Whereas to Jacob, who is the farmer who did the work to get the ingredients collected together to make a bowl of soup, he would rather trade that bowl of soup and get the messianic birthright than keep the soup. And anyway, anybody who's done farm work knows that you do have to put some work into something before you have crops that can be turned into an agricultural product, such as a bowl of soup. Well, we're told that it's better to gain wisdom and to get understanding than the merchandise of silver or the gain that comes from fine gold. And that godly wisdom is more precious than rubies, and all the things that you can desire are not to be compared with true wisdom. All right, another example from the book of Genesis would be Peleg. You have this genealogy in which it's mostly talking about this person. It gives a name, it gives an age, it gives so-and-so is begotten. And that's pretty much what is happening in Genesis 10, as you're getting all this family history, which is mostly names. And yet you have this interesting aside that there was one baby who was born, and he was named Peleg. And the reason why was because in his days the earth was divided. The word for divided here, the verb that Peleg is a noun version of, the word for divided in Genesis 10:25 is not the same verb as in Genesis 10:5 and 10:32 that talk about the separation of people groups based on language, the division of languages at the Tower of Babel. That's a different verb, parad, where this is palag. And what was happening in the lifetime of Peleg that was so unusual that he got named it because during his lifetime the earth was divided? Well, if you were to do a simple concordance study and you were to look up the word Peleg, which is the noun derived from the verb palag, to divide, what you would find is a pattern. If the peleg as a noun appears in Job 29:6, a bunch of times there in Psalms, a couple times in Proverbs, a couple times in Isaiah, and once in Lamentations. And in every one of those cases, the noun peleg is translated in our English Bible as rivers, or in one case, streams, which is, stream is just almost a synonym for river. So what was going on in the lifetime of Peleg was there was something that involved rivers that was so enormous that it was worth naming your kid after. And if you were to study the weather that you would expect after the flood, as the earth is kind of settling down into its new normal, one of the things that you would have are hurricanes that are much bigger than what we have nowadays, even the most recent ones. And they would have gone much farther inland, much higher speeds, much greater quantity of rainfall, and they would have been blasting out river systems like the Mississippi and the Ganges and the Amazon and the Nile and these huge rivers of the world. So the fact that somebody got a name that means river that happened a couple generations after the flood makes sense when we study how weather patterns are affected. But now we'll move on, we will hop on to an illustration of people jumping to a conclusion, okay? And we're talking about grasshoppers. So here's an example of a grasshopper that's found in the Grand Canyon. But here's the supposed problem. And this, I was teaching at Dallas Christian College years ago in the 1990s, and a freshman once he was real nervous, and he was afraid of science because he was afraid people had told him that science had shown that the Bible had errors, and that really bothered him, and so it was rattling his faith. And I said, and this is, if anybody ever says that, here's a suggestion. Tell them, really, you think there's a problem? Give me one example. And more than half the time, that's the end of what they say, because they don't have an example. But every once in a while, they'll come up with one. And then what you do is you say, okay, good. Let me study that example, and I'll get back to you very promptly. Because what you're going to find is when somebody says that there is a scientific problem with something in the Bible, is they either have done sloppy Bible reading or sloppy science or both. Remember the problem with Galileo and the Inquisitors? Okay, both sides didn't understand that both the earth and the sun were moving. In fact, the sun and the earth are moving within the Milky Way galaxy, which itself is moving. And then the Milky Way galaxy is actually moving in relation to other galaxies. So there's so much motion going on, we should be dizzy. But we don't think about it, so we're not. But so both sides in that case had flawed science ideas. And they also had done flawed Bible study, because both of them were ignoring verses that specifically talked about the earth having a circuitous motion, Isaiah 40:22, the sun having a circuit of motion, Psalm 19, and then, of course, misunderstanding Psalm 93:1, which talked about the earth not being yanked off its course, thinking that that verse meant the earth had to be motionless. So what you'll routinely find is that they're doing sloppy Bible reading or sloppy science or a mixture of both. So in this case, this student at Dallas Christian College was worried because somebody told him the Bible had an error in it, and that the Bible had said that grasshoppers only have 4 legs. And yet grasshoppers are insects, and insects have 6 legs. Okay, so the thing to do when someone is concerned about that is not leap away from the problem like a afraid grasshopper, but confront it and specifically look at the actual scientific information about grasshoppers and also look at the verse that they say clashes with it. Okay? So what does the Bible say about grasshoppers? Well, for one thing, Numbers 13 talks about grasshoppers and how they flee, they jump, and that is correct. We do see that grasshoppers are easily frightened. Many animals, when they have some kind of a confrontation, a hostile confrontation, fancy words, agonistic encounter, they'll either fight or they will take flight. That is, they'll either flee or they'll fight. And in the case of grasshoppers, their usual routine is, let's get out of here. All right? But what does the Bible actually say? That's when we need to do Berean research and look at the actual words. And also, what are they claiming that science has proven? Well, 1 Timothy 6:20 reminds us that there's such a thing as science falsely so called, and we need to watch out for that. Okay, so let's get to the answer. The answer is grasshoppers walk on 4 feet. That's it. They walk on the first pair in the front and the middle pair, but the 2 back legs they do not walk on. They only use those for leaping. So when they're not leaping, when they're walking, those back 2 legs are parked up, kind of like landing gear on a plane that's not being used. It's there, and when it's needed, it will be activated. But for right now, it's just kind of put in a park position, and we're not using it. Okay? So that's what's going on. They do walk on 4 feet. They have 8. They have 6 feet. My wife says, don't do math in public. Anyway, so when they spring into a leap, they unleash their otherwise contracted hind legs and powerfully push off from something like the grass or dirt, kind of like swimmers who push off of a swimming pool wall to give themselves a little extra push when they're jumping. And of course, in the case of a grasshopper, when they leap, the length of their leap is 100 times longer than their body length. So in my case, because I'm 5'12", that would be like if I could jump, and I could jump 600 feet. So their leaps are nothing short of magnificent. And a lot of times physicists, they like to study how much power is involved. And they'll say, well, some critters are good at mechanical power and other critters are good at high velocity of using their muscles. And in this case, they're amazed because they find that grasshoppers do both at the same time. They instantly accelerate to high velocity through contraction of muscles and relaxation, releasing the energy stored, and it expands the mechanical power, and they're able to do a jump that's 100 times the length of their body. Okay, so what does Leviticus 11:21 actually say about them? It says that they holek al arba. They are walking upon 4, and then that they have benders from over or above its feet, 4 to leap by them. So 4 walking legs, and then 2 that are benders for leaping. That's what Leviticus 11:21 actually says. So if you do careful Bible reading and careful empirical science, you'll find that Leviticus 11:21 is a very good description of what real world grasshoppers actually do. Moses had it right all along, no surprise. Okay, the next word study is going to be on kinsman redeemer, and we will start that tonight. We won't get through all of it, but the main part that we'll start on tonight will be in the book of Ruth. And before we get to that, we'll look at a couple other things. One thing in Matthew 22:37 refers to Deuteronomy 6:5. And this is interesting. Here's what Deuteronomy 6:5 says. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. What does that word might mean? Well, you could almost translate that, all you're very, very, but that doesn't make sense in English. Sometimes that word, miod, is translated diligently, as if it's an adverb, although it's not actually an adverb. So what does it mean? It has the idea of whatever you are really strong at, but not necessarily physically. So kind of like your talents or your thinking or your wisdom. And in the New Testament, the same verse is quoted, but the Greek word it's given for that last noun is dianoia, which is your mind. So it's not so much talking about physical strength as what you're really good at with your personality, your wisdom, your thinking. All right, here is the Deuteronomy passage that talks about carrying young on her wings. That's the English translation. So the question is, does the actual text of Deuteronomy 32:11 say that an eagle mother carries her little kids, her young eaglets, upon her wings? This has been a stumbling block for some people who said it's never been observed in nature that an eagle mother is flying around with babies sitting on her wings. And so what do we do about that? And the quick answer to that is, what is in our English Bible, Deuteronomy 32:11, is not a really good translation of what the Hebrew text actually says. So we're going to mostly skip the details on that, other than to say, in this passage, for some reason, the translators sometimes translated a masculine as a feminine, and that ends up getting things confused. Plus, there's a bunch of pronouns, a bunch of he's and hims and his, and if you get confused thinking that the his is the eagle when the his is really referring to God, then if you make the wrong guesses about pronouns, you can end up with an understanding of that verse that doesn't make sense. So what it's really saying is that as an eagle stirs up her nest, the problem is the Hebrew actually says his. So it's talking about a male eagle. As an eagle stirs up his nest and flutters over his young, he spreads abroad his wings. And then God is compared to that. The easiest way to understand this is to go back to the beginning of the paragraph, where God is identified as the subject noun of the whole paragraph. And then there's some phrases that compare him to what eagles do. So it's really talking about God found Jacob in the desert. In a howling wilderness, God led Jacob, or Israel, about. God instructed Israel. God kept Israel as the apple of God's eye. And like an eagle, God stirs up God's nest. God flutters over God's young ones. God spreads abroad God's wings. God takes care of Jacob. God bears, or was bearing, Israel upon God's wings. So it's not talking about the behavior of an eagle. It's comparing God's care to him having wings, which of course we know that the Lord did that in the New Testament when he, on Palm Sunday, said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I wish that I could take you under my wings the way that a hen protects her little babies, her chicks, but you wouldn't let me." And so, God has more than once referred to himself metaphorically as having wings to protect the young ones, that similar to the way that a mother hen would protect her baby chicks by gathering them under her wings. Okay, wouldn't want you to miss this one. How would you like to pick up a lizard and cradle it like it's a little baby, or maybe a girl might pretend that the lizard was a doll, and then all of a sudden the lizard just rudely squirts blood from his eye right into the face of the little child holding the lizard? Well, that happened to someone I know who grew up in West Texas. And the lizard that does that is it's what some people call a horny toad or a horned lizard. It goes by different names, but it's the lizard that is found in desert places, including Texas and Grand Canyon. And it reminds me of Judges 20:16, which refers to the Benjamites, who had 700 chosen men who are left-handed, which literally translates a Hebrew word that means right hand restricted, so that every one of those 700 was slinging with a stone at a hare, and he would not miss. Now, what is so great about that, other than that's good skill? Well, the verb that is translated miss, that same word is often translated sin. In other words, missing the mark, sinning is missing the mark. These guys could take a sling and not sin, that is, not miss the target. The target was, in this case, a hare. But we see in the New Testament that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We miss the mark. And so Judges 20:16 gives a very literal comparable to that. So the verb here means these slingers would not causatively err when they would sling a stone. Christ is our kinsman redeemer. What does that mean? We got 15 minutes. All right. The word that is translated kinsman redeemer, sometimes it's just kinsman, sometimes it's just redeemer, is goel. And it's a very important concept in the book of Ruth. So how does a kinsman redeemer redeem his family? Well, we see in Ruth chapter 3 this verb appear many times when there is a discussion, and in this case it's Boaz talking to Ruth about there is another kinsman who is closer in the family tree than he is, and so that guy gets right of first refusal to redeem Ruth. But if he doesn't want to, then Boaz says, I'll do it. And in the process of him saying this, he uses a form of the verb redeem 1, 2, 3, 4 times just in that one verse. So why is redemption necessary? Something is missing. Something needs to be restored. Slaves could be redeemed in the Old Testament. Of course, in the New Testament, Christ redeems our souls. And the word redemption is referred to in a spiritual sense in Genesis 48:16 when Jacob is on his deathbed and he's blessing his grandsons, who are the sons of Joseph, and he refers to the Lord as the one who redeemed me, specifically the angel who redeemed me. So that would be God the Son, pre-incarnate Christophany. Well, in the Old Testament, redemption can also be for a piece of land that belongs in the family, but somehow it's been mortgaged out, or in some way it's been alienated from the part of the family that's supposed to have possession of the land. And so a member of the family who has the rights of a kinsman redeemer can redeem the land. And in this case, Jeremiah, he wants to redeem the land, and it's his way of saying, yes, this land is being, as a punishment for wickedness, God is taking the Israeli people and is sending them to Babylon, and you're going to lose possession of your land. But 70 years from now, God will restore you to the land, and so it'll be important that you own the land. And as a result, owning the land is important, even though you're not going to have the use of it for a long time. But God has promised restoration of the land, and so it's worth redeeming. It's worth buying out of its alienation. So redemption is important in the Old Testament. Of course, in the New Testament, we think of being redeemed by the blood of Christ. So we weren't redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from our lost condition, but rather we were redeemed from the blood of Christ. And so because of that, we have the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. He has redeemed us from iniquity and with the purpose of making us zealous of good works. So not just pulling us out of what was bad, but also equipping us to live lives that are good. So we see redemption a lot in the New Testament, and it has the idea of being released from something that is bad or tragic, and then, of course, being put into something a lot better. In the book of Revelation, a group will say, and you have redeemed us, you have redeemed to God us by your blood. And so that's something He can do. So now we go, with that in mind, we go back to Ruth. We'll see how much we can get in 5 minutes. Ruth starts out in Bethlehem. Interesting place to start out. And there's a famine, and the famine is so bad that a family says, we're not making it here in Bethlehem. Let's go to a neighboring country. They're neighboring if you ignore the Dead Sea between them. And so the pink country that you see on the map, that's Moab. That's where they're going to go. So the one who goes to Moab is Elimelech, his wife Naomi. Oops, some say Elimelech, but I remember pronouncing it Elimelech because I was taught that the way you remember it is Elimelech, 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 Elimelech. Well, anyway, maybe you didn't get that in Hebrew class, but Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons go there. They think they're just going to be there a little while. Next thing you know, they're there 10 years. And in the process, Elimelech dies and his 2 sons die. So now you're left with Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, and all 3 of them are widows. And so Orpah decides to stay back in Moab, but Ruth says, no, I'm going to go with you back to Bethlehem. I've decided you belong to the right God, and so I'm going to stick with you. I learned about the real God from you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I'm going to die. And so she goes back to Bethlehem. That is, Naomi goes back. You wouldn't say that of Ruth because she's not going back. She's going to a place she's never been before. And when Naomi shows up and people say, is that you, Naomi? Because remember, it's been at least 10 years. Well, the word Naomi, this is a word play, means pleasant. And she says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. Why? Because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me very much. She really thinks life stinks. And she thinks that it's because God has dealt bitterly with her. She says, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Now, if I was Ruth, I'd say, empty? Hello? Do you see me over here? I'm with you. Do I count for anything? But Naomi's had a hard time. So she says, why do you call me Naomi? Why do you call me pleasant? Seeing the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. She's decided God is down on me for whatever reason. So what's going to happen? Well, Naomi had a kinsman, that is a person of the family, who was he was a pretty serious guy. He's called a mighty man of wealth, and he has a field. And when Ruth takes advantage of a Hebrew law that allows the poor and the widows, a couple other categories, to go out there and take the leftovers that are in the reaping fields. So it was commanded in Israel that when you gather your grain, you don't gather every single bit of it. You leave some leftovers, the corners of the field and some drops, and that's for the poor to come in. So the poor, they had to go to some effort. They had to come in and collect the leftovers, but that was a way that they could survive. So Ruth goes out there and she gathers up, because they are for the poor and the stranger and the widow. Now the word for stranger there wouldn't apply to her because she doesn't consider herself someone who's passing through. She considers herself, I'm here to stay. But she is poor and she is a widow, so she's double qualified to do this. And then Boaz learns about her, and he asks, hey, who's that? And one of his workers says, she is a Moabitess damsel who came with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And so she's been working hard the whole day. She took one little break, but that's it. So Boaz learned a couple things. He's learned that she is with Naomi, and she's a hard worker. And so he goes and he talks to her and takes her very seriously and gives her permission to drink water, which of course is a big deal when you're in a hot desert situation. Going through the Grand Canyon on a 110-degree day, you think about water a lot. But so that was a major benefit that he gave her. And she replies with, why have I found grace in your eyes that you should take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? And he replies, it's been fully shown me that what you've done, all that you've done unto your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your nativity, and you came to a people whom before you didn't know. May the Lord make whole your work, and a full reward to you of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you are come to trust. He has learned not only that she's a hard worker and loyal to her mother-in-law, and helping her mother-in-law in her mother-in-law's time of need and despair, but he's also learned that she has chosen to belong to the real God and has abandoned the Moabite paganism that she was brought up in. Why would that impress Boaz? In Boaz's family tree, is there something similar? Rahab? Was Rahab a Jew? No. Rahab was a pagan convert to the God of Israel, and she married a Jew, and that's where Boaz comes from. So he knows of Rahab's very remarkable conversion to worshiping and belonging to the real God. And now he sees a non-Jew who has good character and who has abandoned the paganism that she was born into and raised in, and has chosen to convert to belonging to the real God. And he's impressed. He's not a real young man. So it's not like he's never seen, he's never had opportunities to get married before if he wanted to. He's a wealthy man, and he's a man who cares about, do you really take God seriously? Because that's part of his family background. Well, anyway, so he decides that, before he decides anything, Naomi says to Ruth, oh, this is good. Boaz is near kin to us. He's one of our kinsman redeemers. And so she advises Ruth on how to present the problem to Boaz and to ask him to be the kinsman redeemer who solves all the problems. And this is probably a good time to stop. So we'll stop on the kinsman redeemer here. We'll finish up with Ruth tomorrow morning, and then we're going to see a side of the kinsman redeemer that most people don't talk about. But that is a side of the kinsman redeemer that is relevant to New Testament eschatology, and but it has roots in Mosaic law. So let's see. Maybe Dr. Bailey, maybe you could close us in prayer.